Hello, this is Jeff Rouse checking in again from Our Story Studios, where we're about to show you the latest episode of Martin County on TV. We urge you to take a look at the sponsors who made this show possible at the end of this show. They're the ones that made this possible, and be sure and thank them. Hope you enjoy today's show.
Hi, this is Lenny Tweeden. I'm the director of the Martin County Historical Society. Today we have a couple of special guests, Richard and Catherine Wollaston. And, you know, I detected somewhat of a British accent. Could you tell us a little bit about where you're from and what brought you to Fairmont?
Oh, well, we'd never heard of Fairmont until about February last year. And yes, you have detected a British accent. And we come from England. We live just north of London.
Right.
And about February last year, we started taking a bit of interest in my grandparent, my grandfather, particularly. And because I didn't know anything about him. And after a lot of research, which Kate, who's next door to me, did, because she did all the research on it, we found that my great-grandfather, Percy, had emigrated to Fairmont in Minnesota. And we didn't even know Fairmont, or even Minnesota, where Minnesota was, other than we knew it was a state in the USA.
And Percy was kind of a significant figure in the history of Fairmont, wasn't he?
Well, so we found out, but of course when we first looked at it, we didn't realise that at all.
But thanks to Lenny's fantastic museum and everything that he's put on the website, there was a lot of information. And Percy seemed like a real person, and especially when you sent us his photo.
Sure.
That really made a big difference. We read his whole story and the story of all his 13 children. We found out what happened to the grandfather, Fred, and what happened to all the others, where they went all over the United States. And Fred was the only one who ever returned to England. Hence, Richard is English, as they were pretty English when they were here still, I think, weren't they?
And Percy accomplished a lot of different things, but I think the thing he's noted for, as far as historically significant, among other things, but the one thing I think is that he was the first mayor of Fairmont.
Yes. At an early stage, I think in 1878.
And I believe I read he was actually, when he was mayor, he was an English citizen.
Yes.
Which is kind of a unique situation as well.
It was an English colony at that point, wasn't it?
Right.
There were several other English gentlemen.
Right.
Some of them with money. He set up a shop on the corner of, I think it said North Avenue and 2nd Street, but I can't quite place that in today's terms.
That would be correct. That would be kind of the main street of Fairmont, going north up to 2nd Street.
And he built a windmill, and he had a 460-acre farm, and he had a 16-room mansion overlooking Bud Lake, which was very splendid.
On Homewood Drive?
On Homewood Drive, yes. Right. Well, the house was called Homewood, wasn't it? I guess Homewood Drive came later.
Right. What are the most interesting things you found out about your research with Percy? What are some of the really key items or most interesting that you've come across? Or surprising?
I mean, just about everything, I think. I mean, having never known that I had a great-grandfather called Percy, and then having discovered so much about his life in the last year and a bit, he must have been an extraordinarily entrepreneurial and adventurous person.
Right.
The fact that he decided to come to live in Fairmont and make a new life for himself at age over 50 with 13 children, the youngest of which was aged 3, I think, is an extraordinary thing to do, and it just completely bowled me over when I heard about this. And then when he turned up in Fairmont in January or February, I knew it was pretty cold in this part of the world, but I thought he must have been completely mad. Strangely enough, having now come to Fairmont, I think I've just worked out why he came in January. And I think because he wanted to make sure he could plant his beans in, I assume, about May.
That would make sense, yeah.
So there we go. So what is the most important thing about Percy? His enterprise, his extraordinary bravery, bringing that, perhaps even more brave with his wife.
His powers of persuasion, I should think, as far as his wife was concerned. And he was involved in everything. He was on the school board. He was one of the founders of the Episcopal Church here, St. Martin's Episcopal Church, for which he gave quite a lot of funding. And I believe that he remained as a vestryman, or I don't know what you call it here. He was
lay minister.
A lay minister to begin with, until they had a proper minister. And he was a good, solid churchman all his life, and brought up his children the same way.
And you were telling about a bank he was involved in that had some financial problems toward the end, and he did a very noble thing.
Yes.
I think that was what finally made me completely fall for Percy. Percy formed this bank, and I think ran it personally very successfully for many years. And when he grew old and frail, he moved on and he went and lived in Victoria in British Columbia. And he left the running of his bank to his son-in-law. And unfortunately, he didn't run it as well as Percy. And they made some very bad loans, and it went bust. Word got back to Percy, who was sitting in his dotage in his big house, because he'd built an equally big house in Victoria in British Columbia. And he could not stomach the thought of any of the creditors being unpaid. So he sold every asset he had in the world, including his fancy house, and he sent the money back to Fairmont, and every single creditor was paid.
That's an amazing thing.
And Percy died a poor man.
Poor man.
Having arrived here quite wealthy. And it was about 10 years after he'd left. He left here in 1896, so he stayed here 20 years. He made a big mark on the town in that time.
Right.
And it was in 1907 when the bank failed. So it must have been an awful shock to him in his old age.
Right, yeah. Well, that was a very noble thing to do.
I felt so proud of him. I immediately told all my children, and my grandchildren are too young to understand it yet, but they will know about Percy when...
Catherine, could you take just a minute and kind of relate how you contacted us, or how you first got the idea to come here to Fairmont?
Yes, well, I did a lot of work on Ancestry.com, and I also did a lot of plain Googling, and I think it was through Google that I found the Martin County Historical Society and all this information that Lenny had put up. Then I went on your website, I watched some of your videos, and I wrote to you and I asked if you knew anything more about Percy. That's when you sent me the photograph. And we just thought that it seemed so strange, so far away, that rather than sitting in England watching all the Americans come to find their heritage, we would do the opposite, and we would come to America to find our heritage. And in fact, we're going to go to British Columbia later in the year and follow up on the grandfather, who had a very interesting life. In fact, of all Percy's sons, none of them stayed here. I don't know that Fairmont was big enough to hold that many Wollastons, but this grandfather went away and became a district land surveyor in British Columbia. Another one became an accountant also in Victoria. A son-in-law rejoined the British Navy in Victoria. And the youngest son, who was 3 when he came here, Ned, he went homesteading in Montana. And his son, who was another Percy, third generation, wrote a memoir of that, which has been published, and it's called Homesteading. And we were able to get a copy from Amazon and read about that. That was pretty tough, because this was another case of buying land along a railway, which was going to make a lot of money very easily, but it turned out to be poor land. And it was
I think it was even tougher than Minnesota.
I think it was much tougher. They had a tough
See,
time.
when you came now the past week, you flew into Chicago,
We flew to Chicago.
and then from there, did you kind of trace Percy's journey?
Yes. Well, we knew that Percy had gone by ship to New York and then by train to Chicago.
You said not to take the ship to New York, though.
No.
I wanted to, but It would have, in the modern world, it would have taken far too long.
There was a budget consideration as well. But we flew to Chicago and we had a great day there, just looking around. Then we took the train to La Crosse, which is what Percy would have done. And then we got out at La Crosse, stayed in a nice hotel, and then got a hire car. But in his day, he would have stayed in La Crosse and then had to cross the Mississippi. And when he came in January, he would have had to cross the Mississippi on a sleigh because there were no bridges then. And then he got another train which took him as far as Winnebago, took all day. And then they would get out there and stay in it's called Winnebago City, but I believe there were just a few houses there.
Yes.
And then they had to spend a night there. And then they had to come in an open sleigh for 20 miles from Winnebago City, but it took all day. And arrived in Fairmont and found it to be a very small town at that time, but clearly one with great potential.
Sure. Well, having come from close to London and being in Fairmont, Minnesota, what's your impression of our city and area?
We went around this morning in this wonderful day in the sunshine, and we went to where Percy built his house, overlooking the lake. And I immediately thought, I know why Percy came here, because it was absolutely beautiful. And in some ways it felt very much like England, in some ways. And then you look in a different direction, and of course you see these big open what were prairies, and,
Sure.
and we don't have such things in England. It's a very different to what I expected. Having said that, I think when you set out on a journey like this, you don't really quite know what you do expect. You have a vision of some way, but it varies from whether it's something like the Wild West, the cowboy films and the dusty places.
Yeah.
I thought, well, it may be like that, but there is an element of that. It's interesting to see how the streets are so wide here.
The whole town is very spacious.
Yes.
And we've seen some lovely homes as we've driven around, and we love all the colourful wooden houses, and it has a calm feel. Everybody seems very friendly. When we were in the restaurant with Lenny last night, every single person on their way out knows Lenny. We felt a very strong feeling of community, certainly as far as you and your wife Carol are concerned. You know a lot of people.
I'm also astonished how many churches there are in the place. Right. It's just, I've never seen so many churches in a relatively small town.
Yeah.
But
well, churches were key to community and still are, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And I'm still trying to work out what all these people who live in these nice houses actually do.
Well, they must all make a living somehow.
They're clearly making a living, good living somehow, and it's not really evident from the town. Maybe we'll find out more later.
A day and a half. We've a long way to go.
Well, before we close, what was your career? What did you do as a profession before you retired?
I was a lawyer, and as was Kate. We were both lawyers, and we had our own law practice in a larger town than Fairmont, outside London, called Chelmsford, in Essex. So,
would that be like a suburb of London, or?
No, it's
a county town.
It's a county town of the area of the district, and it's a big town. The population's about 120,000. So it's just become, in English terms, a city. Actually,
sure.
We have to get fairly big before we become a city, and but it's a feeder town for London. There's a lot of people commuting from there. And it's very famous for cricket and for the invention of radio. Actually,
really?
Marconi factories were there, and they invented radio in the during the wars, or just before the war.
Sure.
Marconi.
Well, I just mentioned one thing. When I first got the email from Catherine, I saw this fairly lengthy email, and I scrolled down and I saw England. I better reread that again. Then I got the whole connection with Percy Wollaston, and of course I replied, and fortunately they did come to visit, and we certainly appreciate your coming, your interest in Fairmont and Percy Wollaston, and it's just been a great experience for me, and hopefully for you guys too. So,
well, it has been an absolutely wonderful experience for us, and it hasn't ended yet, and we really have enjoyed it. I've just sent an email this morning to a friend of mine. I said this has been one of the most extraordinary trips that I've ever done, and it's a real pleasure. And Lenny,
Your welcome has been so generous.
well, everyone has. I mean, Lenny has been fantastic.
Well, thank you very much for coming, for visiting.